morning, everyone. My name is Richard Green, and I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and this is Lusk Perspectives. Our guest on our episode today is the CEO of Cityview, Sean Burton. Sean not only runs a housing development company, but also is heavily involved in civic activities here in Los Angeles, including having been chair of the uh, Los Angeles World Airports Advisory Board or board, I guess. Um, I don't think people get paid anything for it. That's why I'm always, yeah,
They do not.
yeah. I'm on a board. I'm on a county board now too, and I get paid. Folks, you get free parking when you go to the meetings, so that's about it in terms of perks. And Sean, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of yours and a big fan of the Lusk Center. So really appreciate being here.
So, so Sean, we always start with just to let our audience know who you are. We like people to talk a little bit about how they got to where they are. So, if you could just in a couple of minutes tell us who you are and how you got here.
Sure. I didn't start my career in real estate. I actually started my career in politics. I worked in the Clinton White House in 1993 and 1994 on the healthcare task force, which is a great place to be at 21 years old. And I learned a tremendous amount. It was very exciting. Made a decision from there to go to law school. So I ended up wanted to stay on the East Coast, and even though I was from the West, and kind of get that perspective. So ended up going to NYU Law School, and loved New York City, loved law school, but really wanted to come west. So I went and joined a big law firm, and actually moved to San Francisco in the late 90s, which was a really exciting time there, and a lot of technology investment,
Hmm.
dot-com, boom and other things. And so I was there for a couple of years and then got married and moved back to my hometown of Los Angeles. Um,
Where in LA did you grow up? What neighborhood?
so I grew up actually in the Valley, out in Encino, but then moved up to Santa Barbara and lived near UCSB, in Isla Vista actually, which was quite an interesting time growing up. So, but wanted to get back to Southern California, and ended up getting recruited to go in-house at Warner Brothers. They were a client of the firm. I was at Melvin and Myers, and we worked on a big M&A transaction for them, and got to know the principals there, and they recruited me into the firm, but not in a legal capacity, and I ended up working in the kind of corporate venture capital and strategy group. So that's where I kind of broke from the law and started investing, and was there for 5 years during a really dynamic and interesting time, including the when AOL purchased Time Warner, and a lot of change in the industry, and worked with some great people. But I just didn't love entertainment. It wasn't a passion of mine, and I was missing kind of the tangible nature of real estate and working with cities and communities. And so helped co-found Cityview in 2003. And at the time, as we've talked about this before, Richard, the dominant thinking in real estate for housing was, go buy some land off the next freeway off ramp, and people will drive there,
Hmm.
and we'll build the community. Kind of, if you build it, they will come. And we had a thesis of that there was going to be a generation of people that were going to want to live in cities, closer to jobs and transportation and culture and nightlife, and there wasn't enough housing being created for those folks. So that was at the time we used the phrase infill housing. That seems to have fallen out of favor now, but that's really what we're doing. And it was more difficult to do because you had to deal with, obviously community concerns. You had to deal with lots that had prior use, environmental issues, all kinds of things. And but for those people who could do it well, it was really additive. And so we launched the firm based on a thesis that there's going to be a whole kind of demographic that would want to live in these locations, and it proved out to be a good one. And now, we had, last week was our 22nd anniversary of the firm, and we've now built over, 20,000 homes, and, invested over $6 billion. So it's been a really busy, 2 decades.
So, well, and I have to say you were prescient because there was a view, of course, that our center cities were dying hulks and would never recover. You're probably too young to remember if you were 21 and working in the Clinton White House. Forward to New York dropped dead.
Yes.
There were movies, Escape from New York,
Right.
similar movies about, Blade Runner was kind of a dystopian film about LA.
Yeah.
And there was a view that big cities were, or the central parts of big cities were dying. There's a
Mhm.
woman named Selma Hepp, who is now the chief economist at Cotality, whose PhD dissertation at the University of Maryland was exactly about when that started to turn.
Mhm.
And it was right about the time, it would have been about 3 or 4 years before you started Cityview.
Mhm.
And of course, as we know, before COVID, New York had its highest population ever in its history, nearly 9 million people, in a pretty small amount of space. But other
Right.
central cities, places like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, Seattle, who had lost considerable populations from their peak, nearly recovered or surpassed their previous peak populations. So there was, you came into this at a
Yeah.
really good time. But this is going to prompt the question is we saw COVID did a lot of damage to center cities, particularly some of those that I've just talked about. New York lost people, San Francisco lost people, Chicago lost people. Of course, Los Angeles has lost people. Do you think that's a blip, or do you think we're seeing a return to people not wanting to live in these central places so much?
So first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, COVID really threw right cities for a loop, and a lot of them haven't recovered. I do think you're starting to see cities that have recovered. I mean, I don't know how much time you've spent in San Francisco recently. I've been up there twice in the last month. It really feels like that city has made a turnaround in terms of the investment, the energy, the jobs, the kind of quality of life. Crime is down. One of my colleagues was in Seattle this week looking at a couple projects we're looking at potentially purchasing, and he reported a kind of a similar view. Now that the big companies are coming back in the office 4or 5 days a week, and people need to live closer, and now restaurants can stay open and do a good business, and it kind of creates this virtuous circle of things getting better. Unfortunately, I don't think we've seen that yet in downtown, LA. We still don't have the employers back down there. City employees are not back in the office. Obviously, you still have some crime issues and homelessness issues. So, I do think there's work to be done here in our hometown, but I think the attraction of cities and what's made them great over the last 100 years, didn't go away because of COVID. I just think it got, damaged and delayed, and I do think you're going to see cities come back.
Oh, well, when we look at New York, we do see, like if you look at cell phone pinging on weekends in Manhattan, it's
Yeah,
back to where it was
yeah,
before
yeah.
COVID. So people are going into Manhattan, right? And if you go, I haven't been to San Francisco in more than a year. I should get up there, but I went to New York with my family for my 65th birthday because
Happy birthday.
New York, well, no, this is about a year ago, but,
Happy
uh,
66 then.
yeah, I'm 66. Uh, the thing that was so New York to me is I love New York more than any place in the world, but it's the cliche I wouldn't want to live there.
Yeah.
It's for me too crowded just for day-to-day life, but it's amazing. And it was just striking to me how much of the energy had returned. And I had been there about 2 years earlier, and it you could tell that it was some of the life had been sucked out of it. So its resilience is quite striking. San Francisco, one of the stories about San Francisco is it's AI, and there's all this money being poured into AI. And the good thing is for San Francisco is engineers who live in San Francisco really aren't all that interested in living most other places in
Right.
the country, right? You could say, oh, the cost of living is a lot lower in Dallas, and we have jobs in Dallas, and it's not so much. I want to stay in the Bay Area. And I'm not trying to throw shade at Dallas, but San Francisco is unique. San Francisco's unique. I mean, think about it. if there are 900,000 people who want San Francisco, there's excess demand for San Francisco in a country of 340 million people. So it's not like
Right.
you can't substitute out of it. But I don't know if you've been thinking about this or not, but I have been reading about a lot of people who think we're in the midst of an AI bubble. And, I noticed Michael Burry, who is famous for The Big Short, shut his fund down the other day.
Hmm.
And he was saying, I don't understand the market right now.
Yeah.
And you have, I don't know if you, Steve Eisman, who is the guy who Steve Carell played in The Big Short, the movie,
Right.
he had a podcast the other day where he's worried about the fundamentals. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but is San Francisco's recovery maybe a little bubbly at the moment because of the industry it relies on? And then I'm going to come down to Los Angeles, but
Sure, sure. Look, so a couple of complex questions there. I would say that San Francisco's recovery, for sure, a component of it is the AI investment that's going in there and the millions of square feet of office space that's being assigned. It's also a function, frankly, of all the companies that are there coming back into the office, right? I mean, that's what really hollowed out these cities is, people at, primary remote work, made it really, really challenging. So that's a part of it, but also you have new mayoral leadership up there, new initiatives. You have a new, district attorney up there that's prosecuting crimes. And there's been a lot of initiatives to kind of clean up the city. And so when you walk through the city, it's pretty remarkable. I spoke at a conference a couple of weeks ago up there, and I had a couple hours between meetings, so I went for a 2 hour walk around the city. As a real estate guy, I like to be on my feet and get out and
yeah.
see the real estate myself. And I saw 6 total homeless people in a 2 hour walk. Now, again, I wasn't walking through the Tenderloin and some of those other
But the
areas.
Tenderloin has always been that way.
It
So,
was that way 25 years ago when I lived there. Yes, it's true. But I walked through Union Square and down to the water and down to the through the piers. And I mean, I saw that many people yesterday, 6 homeless people crossing the street when I was in downtown LA. I mean, it's very different. And so I do think there's something to be said for kind of political leadership and vision but obviously back to the office is critical and the AI investment is critical. Look, is there a bubble? I don't know. I mean, Michael Berry doesn't know, so how am I supposed to know? But I will say that look, I do think that there's you're looking at the stock market being all-time highs. That's primarily driven right by corporate earnings, but also by the kind of the tech companies. And I don't follow that closely, but when I look at the investment between OpenAI and NVIDIA and right, and it just you see a lot of circular investment,
yes,
a
you
lot of
do.
that remind me of 1999 and 2000 when you saw those kinds of things. But I mean, clearly AI is real, right? It's changing the way that we work and changing the way we live, and it's not going away. I'm sure there's some hype and hyperbole, but this is a very real kind of fundamental change in our society and technology and kind of leveling up. And so, I think it's going to be here to stay. So that's
Well, and what was happening in 98, 99 was real too, right? Is the Googles of the world arose and the Amazons of the world arose from that. We just didn't know who was going to survive and who wasn't at the time.
right.
And
And
so you
nobody,
were you you
yeah,
were basically buying call options instead of stock
right,
and
right,
stuff.
right. Yeah. Now there'll obviously be some high flyers that go down here and um, right, and some change, but it is here to stay for the long run, and we're an investor that focuses on the long term, not the short term, and so I definitely like the trends.
So let's talk about your invest since you mentioned your long-term focus.
Yeah,
Um, Tell us a little bit about your investment strategy right now. In particular, what are the markets that you like,
yeah,
and what are the markets that you're not so crazy about nowadays?
sure. So we've always been a investment firm that focuses on really the basics, so a little bit boring, and supply and demand fundamentals, and we go through a process every year. We work with third party market study companies and looking at data and look for the imbalances between supply and demand. So what communities have strong demand? Are you seeing growing demographics, growing jobs, educated workers, young people want to move there? How do we define those communities, and target those communities, and then look at where is it also difficult to build new housing, right? So like LA is a great example, right? It kind of meets both those tests. And when you have that kind of strong demand and weak supply, it creates an opportunity for us to come in and be a positive player, to be part of the solution. And it also, frankly, protects your investments from a lot of additional competition, which is good for your investors. We have public pension funds and private pension funds and insurance companies and family offices and invest with us, kind of institutional. And so we're always thinking of their needs and how can we offer them the kind of the best risk-adjusted opportunity. So that's what we focus on. I mean, as far as markets that we like, starting here in California, we really like San Diego. That's a market that used to be sleepy and a kind of a slower economy. You've obviously really seen growth there in terms of technology and biotech. You continue to have a big military and defense base there that is only getting more funding kind of with this administration and what's happening in the world. There's some, Orange County has some interesting markets, and has been, pretty steady in growth. Both of those markets have traditionally been very difficult to build in. Maybe not quite as difficult as LA, but there's not a lot of supply coming online. We do believe in LA County. LA City is tough right now because of the
Yeah.
mansion tax, which we can come
So
to.
tell us, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. So tell us for the audience who doesn't know what it is, tell us what it is and why it matters so much.
Yeah, so in 2022, the city council put an initiative forward to the city to, quote unquote, tax millionaires and billionaires on their mansions and the Palisades and the west side of LA, and to take that money and turn around and give it to kind of affordable housing developers. We're going to build up more affordable housing. And it passed, I think, with 57% of the vote. It was kind of put on at the last minute. The business community and real estate community did a terrible job and kind of making the case known of why it was bad policy. And it turns out that it's not just on millionaires and billionaires and their expensive mansions. It applies to all real estate. So it's a kind of 5.5% tax on certain percentage above 5 million and next percentage above 10 million. But in essence, what it's done is it's fundamentally shut down almost any new housing development in the city of Los Angeles, because it adds about, based on how the math works, it's about an 8% hit to value off the top. And you can invest in a project, lose money and still end up paying a huge tax to the city. And so what investors have decided and developers decided is that you just can't make the numbers work, and they're building housing elsewhere. And it's really, further an existing crisis in LA. Already we were supposed to build 57,000 housing units per year. That's the regional housing needs assessment numbers that the city and the state have agreed on, which is what's necessary, not even to bring rents down or housing costs down, but just to keep equilibrium in Los Angeles. And the year after this passed, permits dropped 20%, and then they dropped down to, I think, 7,700 permits in 2024. And this year, my understanding, I think we've permitted about 3,000 units or so in the first 9 months of the year. Again, we're supposed to do 57,000 per year. So, the housing crisis is only getting worse in Los Angeles City, which is really terrible. I mean, we already have a homeless crisis. We have, young people can't afford to live here. Companies are leaving. The number one reason why companies leave LA is not taxes or regulation or anything else. When you look at the surveys, it's because their employees can't afford to live here. And so this is something we spent a lot of time talking to our local and our state elected officials about and showing them charts. And, I have one here. I always have one on my desk that talks about, multifamily permits in LA and what happened when ULA passed. So we're trying to make some headway on that front, but that's a real challenge for the city. It's probably, it's probably good news for a lot of the people who own apartments here because their rents are going to go higher and higher and higher. No competition, but it's bad for the city. It's bad for renters. It's bad public policy. So hopefully it'll get changed.
So along those lines, since rent stabilization does not, or LA City rent stabilization does not apply to newly constructed stuff, state will it in 15 years.
Right.
Um, the decision of the city council, it was either yesterday or day before yesterday, to cap rents at 4%, um, uh, is the maximum, no matter what CPI is. Do you think that has an influence on investor behavior, or is
Yeah.
it everything's so dominated by ULA that it kind of
It absolutely has an impact because it adds to the narrative that there's a level of political risk that you're going to take if you invest in Los Angeles, that you really just investors don't get paid for. And I try to make this case when I'm talking to electeds. We have big institutional investors, literally some of the biggest in the world, and what they'll say to me often is they'll say, "Look, Sean, we really believe in the LA story. We love the diversity of the economy. We love the educational institutions there, some of the best in the world. Um, we love the creative class. We love the weather. There's all these things that we love, right?
and
About
I gotta throw in healthcare in there
health.
too.
Oh, it's healthcare is right, the number one, right? Number one driver of the economy, right? Obviously, aerospace and defense. Again, you're seeing that come back. So there's so many positives with LA, but they'll say, but there's just a level of political risk we don't get paid to take. So we're deciding as an investor, like, do we, buy a shopping center in Berlin, or do I build a data center in Northern Virginia, or do I build housing in LA? And when we look at those options, it's, there's too much risk here. So I think when you have things like what happened yesterday, which is just the latest thing. I mean, every month it's a new kind of assault on real estate. It just adds to the narrative for these investors to say, it's just not worth it, right? We're going to go somewhere else where we can, have some predictability about what will happen because we're already going to, risk our capital. So it's unfortunate, and I think people have spoken with their feet. I mean, again, if you look at those permit numbers I just talked about, they're devastating for
Yep.
the city and for the region. And again, hopefully eventually we'll get some change here, but until then, rents are just unfortunately going to keep going up.
So, let's talk about one aspect of the LA story, which is something that when people think of LA, they think about, which is the entertainment industry.
Hmm.
And as you know, something like 9% of movies now get filmed in LA.
Yeah.
So we've already lost a lot. Where we've retained a lot is sort of the streaming service stuff still tends to be produced and filmed here, is my understanding. Although more and more of that is
Hmm.
decamping too. I mean, is there a point at which that bleeding starts, and is maybe that just the old LA economy and we shouldn't worry about it so much?
I think it's a critical part of the LA economy, and I hope it doesn't stop. I do know there was, the Governor Newsom passed a, huge tax credit for California, and I've heard from my friends in the entertainment industry that was quite impactful. Doesn't
Okay.
solve all the issues, but it's helpful. Um, and look, it's hard to replicate the kind of creative, energy and creative resources we have here in Los Angeles, right? And creative people want to be around other creative people, the same way tech people in Silicon Valley want to be around other tech people.
It's Enrico Moretti's New Geography of Jobs,
Exactly,
right?
right.
Yeah.
Geography jobs, exactly, right. Or Michael Porter's, clustering, right? And the same idea is you have this clashing um, of talent, and you want that. And so I think that's difficult to replicate. But look, we have to have public policy that supports our industries, and obviously the model has changed with streaming, right? And you're seeing a lot of disruption, and now it's going to change probably even more with AI. And so we need public policy that's going to hopefully be ahead of the curve on that, and working to do everything we can to retain these kind of critical industries and people in our community.
Well, I think, one of the things about the entertainment industry, beyond its direct contribution to the economy, is it's the thing that makes LA fun to live in,
Hmm.
is being here. And it's sort of like if you live in Boston, you go to a Chinese restaurant in Cambridge, you can hear the MIT physics department arguing with each other about Schrodinger's cat or something. And that makes it for me anyway, that makes it a fun place to live.
Yeah, yeah,
And here, a thing that's fun about LA is that you have this variety of interesting people that you just encounter. And as you know, I moved here from Washington, D.C., and Washington's a really good town too, but it's very focused on one thing, which
yeah,
is politics. And there are times I want to be talking about things other than politics. I think about the fact that my wife and I have friends who are a married couple who's a studio musician and a film composer. Okay, it's just fun to be able to have friends like that as opposed to, the people who just do what you do all the time. And so it certainly does add to the richness of LA in ways that go beyond, I think, the direct economic impact of the industry. But so let's come back though. So you're people have qualms about the city of LA for uh,
right.
good reason. What do you like at LA County? Are there communities that you enjoy working with here?
So we're finishing right now 266 units in Gardena, but it's right across from SpaceX, literally across the street. Because that's a community that needs a lot. We've been working with the mayor there and the city, and they've been wonderful to work with. They want housing. They've bent over backwards to help us get this built as soon as possible. They realize the need for it. So that's a great community. We certainly like kind of Burbank and Pasadena. We love Culver City. That's a great. We have a project we built there that's been terrific. Um, and again we like again we'd like to do more in Los Angeles City. We're believers in the city. It's just hard. We are gonna, the kind of only project we have remaining here to build is it's going to be almost 500 units near LAX in Westchester. Um, but that's a project that we put under contract in 2021, and it took
Hmm.
4 years and 40 community meetings, and we had to re-entitle it twice in order to get it approved to build. So I think that's going to be a wonderful project because again, there's basically no new housing being built, and there's people are desperate for housing. So we think that's going to be a success. But that's the kind of challenge you have to go through to get something done in LA.
So,
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
let's talk about a couple of things there. So one is it takes a long time to get a permit in LA, and the second thing that we just found, we put out a report a couple of months ago called Solachan, which is for state of Los Angeles
Mm-hmm.
county housing and neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we discovered is even after you get a permit, it takes twice as long to build an apartment building in LA as it does nationally.
Yeah,
Typically, it's 18 months. Here, it's 35 months.
yeah, yeah.
So let's go through each step. If you could, because you live this,
Mm-hmm.
let's start with the permitting process. What
Yeah,
would you do to streamline the permitting process in LA, conditioned on
yeah,
the fact that you do want buildings that have good plans that are going to stand
yeah,
up and so on
yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah, and I would say that we've done so much in LA over the years. I feel like we build in closer to 26, 27 months for our buildings because again, we've done it so much that I think we have it down to a science. And look, I want to make this clear too. Like, there's a lot of hardworking people in the city that we work with day in and day out, from building and safety to planning to the fire department. So, but they're understaffed. Um, and there just needs to be kind of a streamlining of the process. And I think a lot of the city employees who do this day in and day out would support that. I will tell you about a city that does it very well is San Diego. They created, Mayor Gloria, Todd Gloria, uh, he put a program in place called Complete Communities. to speed entitlements, to speed environmental review, and to speed permitting. And it's interesting, they have this culture there that the someone who's coming in trying to build as a client of the city, and they treat you like a client as opposed to an enemy.
Mhm. Mhm.
They give you comments within 30 days, for example, on the plans that you turn in so that you can quickly move through the process, and they guarantee it. So, there's a bunch of other provisions as well, but that sort of culture, right? Where they say, look, we want housing, we're going to bend over backwards to make it happen. They don't sacrifice anything in terms of quality or safety by doing that way. It's kind of a different way of thinking. So I think changing the culture first and foremost and saying this is going to be a real priority for us and it's in the city's best interest to get this done, it would be kind of a huge step forward.
You're reminding me of a couple of years ago, I took my students to Japan to work on a consulting project, Yokohama.
Mm-hmm.
And we met with the planning office there. And we
Mm-hmm.
asked, how long does it take to get a permit in Yokohama? And
Mm-hmm.
the answer was, if you know what you're doing, 1 week. If you don't know what you're doing, 2 weeks. So,
Yeah,
the implication being now, one of the things is they have what I'll call a lot more commodity housing in Japan than we do
right.
here.
Yeah,
So if you build a 6-story apartment building, it kind of looks like all the other 6-story apartment buildings, and the way the conduits are set up for the same, and so on. But again, what was striking to the students, they talked about this, was very much that customer service orientation,
yeah,
the planning department. And it's not like they'll let you build something that doesn't conform to code. They won't. But
yeah,
they have a system in place that allows for much better turnaround there than they do here. Now, the other
yeah,
thing, you talked about being understaffed. Something I don't know is how large their staff is relative to their city. So Yokohama is almost exactly the same population as Los Angeles. I
right.
need to look into that. I do
Yeah,
know that another place I admire, Singapore, they have a much bigger planning staff relative to
yeah,
population than we do here in LA. So,
yeah. Well, look, and I think there's other issues too, right? I mean, like in San Diego, everybody's there working in person, right? Not everybody is working remotely, right? It's easier to go in and you walk across the counter and you're looking someone in the eye and you can have a conversation about issues. Um, it's very different. I mean, that's a big, that's a big thing. Being able to move more quickly through that permitting process and creating more predictability would, again, speed investment, speed housing, and I think is, critically important.
so let's talk about the second half. So you said you're able to build stuff here in about 26 months as opposed to what we found the average was 35. So what's it? Well, you probably don't want to tell your competitors this, but what's your secret sauce? How do you get stuff built relatively quickly here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we've been doing it a long time. This is all that we do, right? And so we have a great team and I think a very efficient system. We spend probably more time than most developers, significantly more time before we put a shovel in the ground. Like we don't just have our plans done by an architect. We bring in a second architect for a peer review. And we do what's called a page turn, where people sit in the conference room here and we literally go page by page through the set of plans that's an inch thick, looking for any possible anything that isn't addressed that should be, any confusion, answer any questions. And so we're able to kind of lock a lot of that up and at that level. And then we have our contractor, whoever's going to be our general contractor on the project in there as well. And so by the time we're actually moving dirt and putting sticks in the air or pouring concrete or whatever, we have a lot fewer kind of open items and questions. And I think a lot of developers, so we spend more money on the front end, but we end up saving significantly more money and time on the back end. So that's a process we've developed over the 70 or 80 projects that we've developed at the firm, and we've made plenty of mistakes over the years, but we just try to learn from them, and that I think helps us be more efficient and deliver a better product.
So, of course, one of the big problems in LA at the moment is the speed at which we're recovering from those devastating fires from now 10 months ago,
Yeah.
more than 10 months ago. And one of the things people talk about as problematic beyond the permitting process, but things like staging
Hmm.
is how do you get materials up those narrow streets? And so given your experience of figuring out how to do infill development, do you have
Yeah.
any advice for how we could speed up the process of getting these neighborhoods rebuilt?
Yeah, I mean, so we're actively helping to rebuild in Altadena. We actually stood up a new company, which I can come back to, called Genesis
Yeah, please tell
Builder.
us about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll tell you about that, and this doesn't relate to the Palisades, but basically, we're involved civically, as you know, Richard, and helping out in a lot of different capacities. We spent a bunch of time with the mayor immediately after the fires and her senior team, where we helped bring in some former housing secretary, senior people in FEMA who had helped rebuild after Katrina and after Sandy to help the mayor put together a playbook of kind of best practices. But we sat around and said, well, geez, we're the largest multifamily developer in LA County, and what can we do from a business perspective to help people rebuild, even if it's not multifamily? So we spent a bunch of time talking to people in the Palisades and Altadena, and ultimately decided that where we could be the most helpful was to focus just on Altadena, and to not invest or buy lots or anything like that, but just to help people rebuild their homes who wanted to rebuild. And so the number one issue that people faced was cost. They were underinsured. They still had a mortgage. There was a bunch of challenges. So we said, how can we really drive costs down? So we decided that we looked at the 5,700 homes or so that burned in Altadena and realized that about 80% of them were between 1,000 square feet and 2,000 feet, and were sat on a 50 by 150 square foot lot. So we pre-designed um, 6 different floor plans at different sizes and with 4 different elevation types, and went to the county and said, could we get these pre-approved with you? Could we go through that process and get them pre-approved? So when we come back with someone who owns, we can kind of speed through the process. And they hadn't done that before, but they created a process. They were great to work with. And we got 24 different plans pre-approved. And then as we talked to potential, to homeowners who needed to rebuild, they said their biggest concern was a number of concerns, but they were concerned about price, like how am I going to make sure some contractor's not going to hit me with all these builder overruns, and they were concerned about timing. They said, we're hearing it could take 2 or 3 years to rebuild or longer. They were concerned about quality. And of course, they were concerned about like, how do we make sure this is fire resistant? How can we use kind of best practices within our budget to make sure this doesn't happen again? So we created a product. One, we could bring costs down for them by building in bulk. So we kind of created a production home model where we could deliver
Hmm.
20 or 10 homes at a time, still customize them for people within these 24 floor plans, but we could build, more efficiently because we'd have, building multiple homes at once. We could obviously bring the cost of materials down by buying in bulk, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then what we decided is to give people a price guarantee. We said we're going to fix the price the day you sign the contract and we go vertical, and we will guarantee that price. If there's tariffs or anything else, we're going to bear those needs. So you can sleep well at night knowing that we're going to deliver this house for what we say we will. And the second thing we did is we said we're going to deliver it within 12 months from when we start construction. Um, and if we don't, by the way, every day beyond 12 months, we're going to pay you a penalty, liquidated damages, just like you would do in the commercial world. And then the third thing we do is we give people kind of a 10-year warranty on the quality. And then on the fire resistance, we kind of looked at the existing code and then we added a bunch of features over and above that, to make it as fire resistant as kind of possible. So we created that firm, Genesis Builders, and we have our first kind of 20 families that we're building for, and then we have another 40 or so that we're talking to, and kind of, you have to walk through the process with.
And are those 20 in proximity to each other, or are they
They're
adjacent to each
relative
other?
relative proximity. It takes about 3 months from when someone comes in before you can actually put sticks in the air, because you have to, plot the home on their specific lot. You have to do soils testing, and then even once you're ready to go, you got to go back to the county and say, okay, now this home's ready to go on this lot. We need our final approvals there. But we were thrilled. We took our first one last week to the county that's kind of ready to go vertical of the first batch. And the county planning approved it in 4 days. We were thrilled, and again, they've been great to work with, and we got to go to building and safety and fired it before we go vertical. But um, they were comfortable because they had pre-approved all the homes before, so it was a much quicker process. And our goal is to get kind of sticks in the air before the holidays, and deliver our first homes at kind of this time next year.
So I have to ask, since you have the 10-year warranty, do you worry about, and the reason I ask about that is it reminds me of why we don't build a lot of condos
Yeah,
in California, or actually a lot of other, this is not a uniquely California phenomenon. This is true
right,
in lots of states,
right.
is basically you could sue for defects up to 10 years. And once the place is 10 years old, you can't anymore. And the way a number of people who've done built condos, they say there's a cottage industry of attorneys who wait till, 9 years and six
That's correct.
months.
Yep.
And so do you worry about that contingent liability out there 9, 10 years from now?
I mean, we plan for it. Again, we're not building condos. It's a worse for condos, right? We're building single family homes. We may end up building townhomes as well. But we built, thousands and thousands of homes in California over the years at Cityview. And so we're, well aware at how to, one, build high quality, and two, kind of, plan for potential, cottage industry of attorneys. The unfortunate part about that, about the strict liability laws, is those costs get passed on to the consumer. People don't always realize that, and that's one of the reasons housing's so expensive and why we don't build enough for sale housing here in California, is because of those strict liability laws in that cottage industry. But we're confident with the products that we're building here in Altadena, that we're not going to, have too many of those issues.
So the other thing is, in terms of the rebuilding process, what about infrastructure? Power lines being buried or not being buried, water hookups, sewer. What are you
Yeah.
finding there? Are things more or less intact, or is there a lot of work that has to be done there too?
There's still work that has to be done, but there's, I think, significant progress. I think it's ahead of where we all intended, we thought it would be. Um, but there's serious questions about, should you put lines underground or not? Obviously, we don't get into those, but we know it's going to cost, 3 times as much to put them underground. And you also got to make sure you have, phone and Wi-Fi. I know Spectrum's out there, and we're working on those kinds of issues. But I do think you've seen a pretty good effort by the infrastructure firms to, these utilities to, just kind of power these communities again. And I think that's really positive.
So you said something earlier in the conversation that I want to come back to because I think I heard it right and it was fascinating. Retail center in Berlin. Did I hear you say that?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're doing retail in Berlin.
No, no, I'm not. Sorry, I wanted to. Sorry, let me clarify that. I'm not doing retail center Berlin, but we have these
Oh,
big
you're investors.
global investors that
Okay.
have this broad palette on which they can
Got
paint.
it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. Now that makes sense. I thought, hey man, why did you choose that?
No,
Actually, Berlin is a very tough town to do business
yeah,
in
yes, it is.
too.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say the LA City Council is not crazy about capitalism, but they're Adam Smith compared to government officials in Berlin. So uh so
Yeah.
I want to come back sort of to wrap up just your investment strategy. You talked about your long-term players. Do
Yeah.
you ever sell your stuff after you develop it, or do you hold things kind of forever?
Well, we do both. It really depends on who our investors and capital sources are. Sometimes when we have big institutions and these big commingled vehicles, they'll have a life on them, or 8 or 10 years, and the
Yeah.
investors will want us to round trip those investments and sell those assets in time. Other investors we work with have a longer term view, and they will do kind of what we call a build to core model, of where we will buy and design and develop and lease up a great multifamily project, and then just hold on to it to that investor for the long run. So we do both depending on, our capital needs. And I will say that everything we build or buy is something we would be comfortable with holding for the long run.
Okay.
We're
Because I was
not.
going to ask, does it influence how you build or where you build in terms of how rapidly you need to return the
It,
capital?
it doesn't because I just, like I'm not Michael Berry. I'm not smart enough to time the markets. So we like to be in these markets that have long-term solid fundamentals. And that's the focus. Now markets do change, right? I mean, you obviously, San Francisco, as I mentioned earlier, we had, two wonderful projects that we built up there in 2011 and 2012 south of Market. And of the 55 assets we own, those were the two top performers until COVID. And they were, of the 55 assets, they were the last two assets to recover and get back to their pre-COVID rents. So markets do go through fluctuations and cycles. And, one of my real estate mentors once told me, like, don't fall in love with the real estate.
Yeah.
To make the best, decision for your investors. And we do that. We spend a lot of time and effort thinking about the markets we want to go into, the sub-markets we want to go to, the products we want to develop, what are the price points. And we have definitely a long-term view in making those decisions. And then we obviously adjust as necessary.
So, final question is Governor Newsom signed a law a couple of months ago that basically says that if you are within half a mile of rail transit in California, you can build up to 85 feet, no CEQA review, no prevailing wage, no, it's by right, you can do it. How much of a game changer do you think that is?
I think that bill combined with the CEQA reform that they did in June is a complete game changer for California development. I think it's the most consequential, land use change that I've seen in my career. And we're a big believer that that's going to create a housing and development boom, probably everywhere but Los Angeles City because of ULA, unfortunately. And we're leaning into that. Just so you know, we have talked to our investors. We've reoriented a bunch of our team to focus on how can we, develop more of these kind of mid-rise infill projects, which is exactly in our sweet spot. We don't build high-rise, and we generally don't build garden. We build these 5 to 8 story, less than 85 feet buildings. And so I think it's really impactful. I give a lot of credit to the governor. I give a lot of credit to Buffy Wicks in the
Hmm.
assembly, who's really been a leader on thoughtful, housing reform, particularly around housing production. I give a lot of kudos to Ezra Klein and Derek Kaufman, who wrote the Abundance book and kind of capturing. All those ideas aren't theirs, but they kind of captured it, and it's created a movement in the Democratic Party, at least in the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, for the five people that are left in that wing, and they have, and it's created an intellectual framework that I think is really, really critical. So I think that's one of the most positive things that's come out of California in a long time. And again, I'm excited to see that the additional housing that that's going to create in the state.
Yeah, I think Scott Wiener maybe needs a shout out too if
Yes,
we're
Scott's
crediting
been
people.
wonderful. Yes, you're right. That's my fault. Scott's been terrific as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just in terms of operationalizing it,
Hmm.
so assembling parcels in order to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you go about doing that?
That's probably the hardest part of the
Yeah.
business, right? Is assembling those parcels. But look, it's about getting a lot of shots on goal. It's about a lot of time and effort. Especially when you're working with families that have owned these sites for generations. The grandfather bought the site, and then the daughter had it, and now there's a trust of 8 kids who grandkids who control it, and it's their income, and so it's hard to get them to agree. So it's a ton of work, but that's you just got to stay after it, and to me, that's where we get to really be creative as a firm, and work with these families and these trusts to come up with something that's going to meet their tax needs and meet their capital needs. But it's well worth it. And there's, just yesterday I was down at this project that we're finishing across from SpaceX. We're calling it Apollo, after the kind of Apollo space program. And it's got a theme, kind of a space theme throughout it. That's great. And, but I looked at that site when it was a dilapidated kind of warehouse. It was half empty, and now it's gonna we're gonna have 400 or 500 people that are gonna live there in this kind of, beautiful, beautiful units. And I take a lot of pride and satisfaction in being able to create housing and for people and that are at, kind of rents that they can afford. And anyway, so that's a part of my job I love. And so we're gonna keep assembling the land, and we're gonna keep fighting the good fight on the regulations and the entitlements, and keep building good projects.
So Sean Burton, CEO of Cityview, thank you for getting at it, and thank you for coming on Lusk Perspectives. It was really great to spend an hour with you this
All
morning.
right. It's been great. Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate it.